Let's start with Atlantis. Is that going back far enough for you? Okay. If any of you heard Klaus Donna's wonderful presentation, he very graphically showed that there are just all of these amazing artifacts and pieces from all around the world, pyramids all around the world. In the far distant past, prehistory, there was a worldwide, highly advanced civilization. But something happened. They either had a war, they had, launched nuclear weapons, and there is evidence for that in the Hindu Vedas and in the Sumerian tablets. They talk about weapons that could destroy whole cities. If you're heavy into the Bible, think Sodom and Gomorrah. Boom, they're gone. Lot, by the way, we're told in the Bible that, they were going over the hill and his wife stopped and stood and looked back and she was turned into a pillar of salt. Well, I have talked to Bible scholars and they tell me that the word in ancient Hebrew that they get pillar of salt from actually also means dust, or powder. So in other words, she was vaporized. And apparently the rest of the people had gone down the hill and they survived, just as we hear of accounts from Hiroshima where two people are standing in the street and the bomb goes off and one of them is vaporized and the other is behind a building and they survive. So we have all of these tantalizing bits of evidence that there was some sort of cataclysm, perhaps a war, and certainly great earth changes, and this worldwide civilization crumbled and fell into ruin, and we are only now picking through these thousands of years worth of history, and we come up with a little of this and a little of that. This, of course, creates great controversy among all of the archaeologists and the experts because think of the arguments over where was Atlantis. Some say, well, it was an island in the middle of the Atlantic. Some people say it was on an aircraft going way over our heads. Some people say it was Antarctica before a pole shift, and some argue that it was the island of Santorini. Others argue that it was the island of Cyprus, and personally I think they were all right. It's all of that. This was worldwide. So this started it, and of course today we think that we're the apex of civilization. No, we are just now pulling ourselves out of the dark ages and out of the primitive conditions that resulted after this great cataclysm. But something came out of that. Manly P. Hall was a very high-ranking Mason, an occultist, and he's written a number of books, but as he himself said, that in the remote past the gods walked with men and they chose from among the sons of men the wisest and the truest, blah blah, and these illumined ones founded what we now know as the ancient mysteries. So in other words, some of the knowledge that had been passed along from this ancient civilization, wherever it came from, ended up in the ancient mystery schools in Egypt. Obviously, too, all roads lead to Sumer because that actually was the world's first recorded highly technological civilization. And of course, it was located in the Fertile Crescent in what is now modern day Iraq, the one place you and I can't just go travel to. I'm not sure that's just coincidence. And the Sumerians obviously had great advanced knowledge because on this stele you can see that they not only have depicted our solar system, but the planets in proper proportion. Uranus was not known to man until it was discovered in 1781, Neptune in 1846, and poor little Pluto was not discovered until 1930. And of course I say poor little Pluto because now he's no longer a planet. He's just a Disney character. We know about this because of the Sumerian tablets. This is the Cuneiform. They'd take a stylus and they'd etch it into wet clay and make their characters, and then they'd bake it. So it's stone. and it has lasted for thousands of years. Interesting, there's about 500,000 known in existence, and only 20% have been translated. So if any of you younger people are out there and you want to know, wondering what to do with your life, I'd say learn Sumerian. Let's get the rest of those things translated, because maybe we can find out what's going on. And these tablets, of course, predate the Bible by about 4,000 years. And what do they tell us? They tell, and more than once, more than one place, they tell us that 432,000 years before the Great Flood, the Anunnaki came from Nibiru through the Great Bracelet, which they figure is the asteroid belt, and they landed in the Persian Gulf. Anunnaki being literally translated as those who came from the heavens and landed on the earth. And they began to colonize, and they began to search for gold. Now, why were they after gold? Well, many reasons, but one of the key things seems to be that they were looking for gold to repair their homeworld's atmosphere. And this is not at all far-fetched, because Dr. Edward Teller and several other reputable scientists have long argued that to repair the ozone holes in our atmosphere, it would be great to put pulverized particles of gold in the upper atmosphere, which is it's very conductive, and it would provide a heat shield, and it would ultraviolet rays would bounce off of it, and it would hold down the global warming that is we see evidence of taking place right now today. So originally, they were trying to extract gold from the Persian Gulf out of water, but that was a very slow, tedious process, and you didn't get a whole lot of gold out of it. So before long, they finally realized they could mine for gold, but then they had a problem, because here's these astronauts, and they come here, and they want to, and the next thing you know, they end up being gold miners. Well, you know, that's hot, hard work, and they weren't happy with that. So there were some strikes, there was some conflict going on, and there was a big argument in the Council of the Anunnaki about what are we going to do about this. And of course, there were always the right-wingers who said, well, you know, just let's kill the revolutionaries and the strikers, but others took a more calm view, and their science officer, Enki, says, well, you know, wait a minute, I've got this laboratory in the Abzug, which has been translated as Africa, and he said, I've been working with these earth primitives, and he said, I think that I can tweak with their DNA, and we can improve the breed a little bit, and we can have a worker race and let them do all the gold mining. And most of them said, hey, that's a good idea. Interestingly enough, they had the same ethical arguments that we have today about gene splicing, cloning. They said, wait a minute, it's not our role to play God. We shouldn't be creating anything. And Enki said, no, you're right, I'm with you, but we're not creating anything. We're simply improving the breed, just like we do, right? Dogs, cats, animals, eugenics. We want to improve the breed. So they improved the breed, and they even explained how it was done. They took the egg of an earth primitive, and they fertilized it with the sperm of an Anunnaki male, then implanted that in the uterus of an Anunnaki female who carried it to term, and then via cesarean section gave birth to what they call the Adama, or the Adam. The first earthling, a hybrid. Now, you have to understand, though, that this wasn't just that quick a deal. They didn't just create a hybrid and there we were. Actually, it took place over thousands of years, and the first Adama was like a mule. It was a hybrid. It could not reproduce. All right, but they kept tinkering with it until they finally got Cro-Magnon, or modern man, which could reproduce. And by the way, this explains why they've never been able to find the missing link, because there is no missing link. They took Neanderthal or even more primitive forms, and they dabbled with their DNA, and they created the Cro-Magnon modern man. And then pretty soon after they had created humans that could reproduce, we were like rabbits. We're just reproducing all over the place. I don't know if any of y'all saw the old Star Trek thing about the tribbles. You know, we're the tribbles. We just kept multiplying and multiplying, and it was causing the Anunnaki some problem, and a lot of the more conservative of the Anunnaki said, this is getting out of hand. And besides that, they're getting smarter. And, you know, the next thing you know, we would have created a Frankenstein monster, and because these humans are going to be as intelligent and as productive and creative as we are, and we don't need that competition. So it was decided either to create this great flood, or they knew that it was coming, and they decided we'll just let the great flood wipe out humanity, and then we don't have to worry about them anymore. Except one of the Anunnaki, perhaps Enki, because he'd been working with us and maybe had helped create this genetically modified race, he took pity on them, and so he contacted, according to the Sumerian tablets that predate the Bible by 4,000 years, a person by the name of Upnapishtim. And he told Upnapishtim, there's going to be a big flood, and you better build a boat, and you better, you know, get everything ready. He told him how to build it, gave him the dimensions, told him how to seal it. And if that sounds familiar to you, because it's identical to the biblical story of Noah, with just two significant differences. One is the name in the Sumerian tablets is Upnapishtim, and in the Bible, of course, it's Noah. But there's another slight difference that certainly answered a question for me. As far back as Baptist Bible school, when I was a little kid and I heard the story of Noah, and he took two of every animal and he put them on the boat together, and they sailed around for, you know, months. And I'm going, wait a minute, you got lions and tigers and bears, and they're all right there on the same boat with the gazelles and the sheep. You know, they're going to eat each other. You know, how can that work? And besides that, what do you do with all that waste? I finally figured that one out. I figured that's where we got the poop deck. But then you read the Sumerian tablets, and all of a sudden it comes clear. They've already talked about genetically modifying the race and gene splicing and, in vitro fertilization, so they knew this stuff. So in the Sumerian tablets, Upnapishtim is told to take the seed of every living thing. Oops, now instead of a boatload of animals, you got a little closet with vials of DNA that they're able to use to repopulate the world after the Great Flood. Interesting, huh? And yet, after the Great Flood and after all this devastation, and the humans again begin to evolve and work on the thing. And by the way, I was studying some scientific papers about the advent of farming, agriculture. Now, you would expect that, and for one thing, as you might expect, agriculture began over in the Mesopotamia area, northern Iraq, southern Turkey, right at the area where Mount Ararat is. And according to both the Bible and the Sumerian tablets, the ship landed on Mount Ararat. And the gods, the Anunnaki, came back, and they said, oh, well, we didn't kill them all off, but at least there's just a handful of them, so we'll take care of them. And so they began to teach them civilization. Everything we know today, the the calendar, the legal system, agriculture, it all stems from the Sumerians. And but agriculture came too. Now, you would think that agriculture would begin in the river bottoms where you've got really rich soil and lots of water, and then it would spread to the more arid areas. But the first known farming was in the mountainous areas around Mount Ararat, and it worked its way down. Okay, which again gives credence to the story of the Great Flood. And then we do have these anomalies, which generally are kept hidden away in the basements of museums because they can't really explain them, like the Baghdad battery, They didn't know what that was for a long time until somebody figured out that you could put the copper tube down in it and the pin and then fill it with grape juice, very acidic, and oops, it produced a half volt of electricity. So they had electricity, and this is how they were able to gold plate some of these ancient artifacts. We also know that there are tantalizing signs that the Egyptian had some sort of advanced technology, generally in the form of energy manipulation. This is interesting. Here is, this is from the Amiens Cathedral, and it's depicting Ezekiel and his fiery wheel. It sounds like a UFO today, but of course they didn't know about that. But then next to it over here, we have an artist's conception of a warp drive spaceship using 0-point energy. Notice the similarities. Maybe that's the way to make a warp drive. So here was all this knowledge, and bits and pieces of it. It wasn't whole, it was disjointed, but there was some incredible knowledge of energy manipulation that began in the Sumerian cities of Ur, Uruk, Sapur. And what happened to it? Well, we had a fella whose most of the Sumerian major cities were named after him or his relatives, so he was not just some schnook. He was a Sumerian royal. He was a person of very high rank, and he made his way from Samaria down into Egypt. And of course, that was the patriarch of both the Hebrews and the Palestinians and the Arabs, the biblical Abraham. And Abraham, as you can learn from the Bible, came from Chaldea, which was simply an ancient term for Mesopotamia. So he was not a Jew, he was not an Arab, he was a Sumerian. And he had the knowledge, and he brought it into Egypt. And before long, what happened? The Egyptian civilization just appears. And if any of you know your Egyptology, you realize that the older dynasties were more sophisticated, more technologically advanced than the later dynasties, because in other words, it devolved rather than evolved. In fact, they keep us off balance, because in school you learn about the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Phoenicians, and we think these are all separate civilizations that waxed and waned over there in the near Middle East. Folks, they were all stages of the de-evolution of the great Sumerian civilization, and yet bits and pieces of the knowledge continued. Which leads us to a very interesting question about, was Moses actually Akhenaten? We all know the story of Moses, that he was hidden away as a baby because the Pharaoh said he was going to kill the eldest son and newborns of all the Hebrew slaves. And that doesn't make any sense on the face of it, because the slaves were considered property. You know, do you go and bash up your new car? No. If you have a herd of cows, do you kill off all the calves? No. It's just never made any sense to me. But then we were told to keep him from being killed. Little baby Moses is placed in a basket of bulrushes. He's floated down the river to relatives, and they raised him. But he was educated as a high-ranking Egyptian. And it was through his Hebrew slave foster family that he was imbued with the idea of monotheism, the one true God. But then let's look at the Egyptians. The Egyptians tell us about Akhenaten, who originally was Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep III was a vicious, bad pharaoh, and he did not want anybody threatening his throne. So he said if there was any male child born to one of his wives, that child was to be put to death. Ooh, that makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Okay, you only killed one kid, not all these kids. Well, his wife Tari, who was one of his wives, gave birth to a young son who had been in line to become Amenhotep IV, and under his decree, then he was scheduled to be killed. And she didn't want her child killed, so she put him in a basket of bulrushes, sealed it, floated down the river to their slaves, the Hebrews, who raised this boy from a child. Same story. And now you can see why he was educated as a high Egyptian, because he was a pharaoh. And when Amenhotep III died, Amenhotep IV took charge, immediately changed his name to Akhenaten, the worshiper of the one true God, and he began to shut down all of the temples and reduce the priesthood, and you can imagine, how well they took that. And but he was a pharaoh. He was a god. You couldn't kill him, but you could exile him. So they told him, you get out. And they told him, but you can take, whoever you want to with you. So, of course, he took the foster family that raised him, not his birth family, which were the Hebrew slaves, and they took their relatives. And so all the Hebrews started leaving out of Egypt. So Akhenaten told him, changed his name to, he didn't change his name, but he became known as Moses, because Moses is a term that means the pretender to the throne. So it's not a name, it's a title. And so Moses told the Hebrews, we're leaving, take anything that you need, meaning take food, clothing, take your private possessions. But they took this as a license to steal, and they took everything wasn't nailed down, particularly a lot of gold and silver. And of course, then we know the story of how they went off into the wilderness, and 40 years they traveled around through the wilderness and defeated one city-state after another one. And every time they defeat one of these city-states, they did what was the tenure of the time, which was to take everything as war booty. Took slaves, took gold, silver, anything that wasn't nailed down, they'd take it. Well, after 40 years of this, they had accumulated a vast treasure, not only of gold and silver and precious stones, but also of knowledge. Some of the steels and writings, tablets that had all of this ancient knowledge. And some of this knowledge included the knowledge of the Egyptians about the mafus, or the manna, or the white powder of gold that they would present to the pharaohs on his 7 steps to the afterlife. And at each step he would stop, hold the conical bread, as it was called, and say, what is it? Because they weren't sure what it was, but they knew it had some miraculous properties. So they also, Moses, who was educated in the ancient mystery schools of Egypt, knew how to produce the white powder. And so in the wilderness, when the question was, how am I going to feed all these Hebrews that were carrying around, they would wake up in the morning and there'd be a white powder lying around on the ground. And they would say, what is it? And in ancient Hebrew, what is it? The word is manna. It was the manna from heaven, because they just found it on the ground. They figured it must have fallen out of the sky. And they'd take this powder and they'd put it in little cakes, and they'd bake it and they'd eat it. And that was the manna from heaven. But now we know, with the discovery of ORE, orbitally rearranged monatomic elements, that within the food we eat and water we drink, there are minute, tiny, single atom elements of gold, silver, copper, cobalt, nickel, and platinum metals. And this is necessary to maintain our health and well-being. Interestingly enough, orbitally rearranged monatomic elements, the acronym is ORME, and ORME is ancient Hebrew for the tree of life. Now, in the 1950s, we had a pretty primitive idea of the atom. You got a nucleus, and you got the electrons flying around it. But then here, as you can see, This is out of a modern encyclopedia, and our knowledge of the atom has increased considerably. It's much more complicated than we thought. But the key thing to remember is that in an atom, you got the little nucleus and you've got the electrons that go around it. And other than that, it's like 98% empty space. So when you've got something solid like the chair you're sitting on, or this table, we think, oh, that's a good solid material object, but as we really know, it's nothing but a whole bunch of atoms crammed together, and it's mostly empty space. And that, therefore, if we could get our frequencies in alignment with the frequencies of the atoms of this table, theoretically, you could put your hand right through the table. And maybe this explains why the ETs walk through walls and do all kinds of weird things, because it's all part of this ancient technology, which we are now using to build the new fuel cell technology. And they're finding very strange things about it because, for example, elements mounted in charcoal and placed on the fuel cell show no trace of rhodium, and yet it acts as only rhodium can. So there is a change going on at the molecular structure. And we are just now beginning to get into this, and the public hardly knows anything about this. But here's some of the scientific papers talking about the deformation of the nucleus, which changes the material object. Interestingly enough, subjected to certain energy fields, the nucleus will elongate and change into kind of this dumbbell shape. And I thought this was really interesting because it pretty much matches the ancient symbol for infinity. So we're talking about the basic building blocks of the universe. Interestingly enough, they found that they could take single atom elements of gold, and through a smelting process, a heating process, it can be reduced to a fine white powder. And when you put the powder in a scale, the scale weighs 4% less than it did before you put the powder in it. It's got anti-gravity properties, which, as you'll see, may answer some things. Because now we're talking the basic building blocks of the universe, subatomic elements. All right. And Moses knew about this, and he was feeding them the white powder of gold as manna. But he goes up on the mountaintop and he gets the 10 Commandments, and when he comes back, he finds out that the Hebrews have, knowing that there's something very magical and mystical about gold, has melted it all down into a golden calf, and they're worshiping it. And that really makes Moses mad, so he throws the tablets down and crashes them. And I don't know, maybe you hadn't read your Bible lately, but I always thought this was kind of funny. The first time he went to the mountain, God wrote out the 10 Commandments. So he brings them back to the people. They're worshiping this golden calf, so he throws them down and breaks them, and he has to go back to the mountain and say, God, I kind of broke your commandments. Could you write me some more? And God says, no, I'm not going to write you no. And so you just do it for, you can just make your own copy. So the 10 Commandments we have are not the original that God wrote. We're getting what Moses remembered. See, I think he said, honor your mother and father, and so that's interesting. But what's more interesting is we read in Exodus that he threw the tables out of his hand, he broke them at the foot of the mountain, and he took the calf which they had made, burnt it with fire, ground it to a powder, and made the people of Israel drink it. Now, obviously, he's not talking about molded gold, because molten gold, that would kill you if you tried to drink it. No, he gave them the white powder of gold to increase their intelligence and to make them more healthy, wealthy, and wise. And where'd he get it? In 1914, on Mount Horeb in the southern Sinai, which is also known and traditionally as the Mountain of Moses, Sir William Petrie found this, what he described as an ancient Egyptian temple. But within the temple was smelting operations. And in his writings, he tells how that when they lifted up the flagstones, what was under there? a fine white powder. This is where Moses was making the white powder of gold, the manna to feed his multitudes. But of course, Petrie in 1914, he had no idea what that was. They just left it open and the wind blew it all away. But we can see the trace of this ancient knowledge of energy manipulation coming all the way up through Moses. Now, after 40 years in the desert of collecting treasure, more booty, more knowledge, they finally got tired of schlepping it through the desert, and they decided, okay, we're going to build a temple and we're going to put it all in there. So they, of course, built Solomon's temple. And interestingly enough, Solomon's temple was an exact carbon copy of a Sumerian temple dedicated to their god Ninurta, which had been constructed more than 1,000 years before Solomon's temple. Nothing new under the sun. They're just following the ancient knowledge. Now we know that in Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holy place was just a little room at the back. This is where they kept the Ark of the Covenant, which they could communicate with God through the mercy seat. And then they had this huge big barn light outfit. Well, what was that for? That was to store this immense treasure of gold, silver, precious stones, and more importantly, scrolls, tablets, steels with ancient knowledge on it. So what happened to this fabulous treasure? Well, the Romans came to Palestine and said, we're going to take over, and if you want to fight us, we'll fight you, but we'll whip you, and then we'll really, it'll be terrible. Or you can just yield to Rome, and we'll let you have your own king, and you can run your own affairs, and all you have to do is pay tribute to Rome. So the Hebrews and Israelites say, oh, okay, that sounds pretty good, we'll do that. But by 66 AD, they were chafing under the Roman rule, and they finally broke out into open revolution, and they revolted against the Romans. Well, they knew the Romans weren't going to sit still for this, and they're going to come back and try to take it all back, so they did not want them to get their hands on the best of the treasure. So what to do? They couldn't just hide the whole treasure away, because when the Romans came, found it was all empty, then they're going to just keep looking for it. So what they did was take the best of the treasure, mostly the knowledge and the ancient wisdom, and they sealed it away under the Temple of Solomon, although it wasn't actually under the temple, it was under his horse stables. Okay, they figured, no way, who's going to go rummaging around in the horse stables? And they had catacombs down there, and they sealed them up, so even if you got in there, you wouldn't realize that this was something behind this wall. So in 70 AD, sure enough, the Romans came and they sacked Jerusalem, and they got a goodly portion of the treasure, probably just the gold and the silver and the wealth. But that was good enough for them. And what did they do with it? They took it back to Rome as war booty. So what happened to that? 400 years later, Alaric the Goth, who had started off as a military officer for the Romans, he revolted and led his troops and became the first of the barbarian hordes to sack Rome. Well, he got his hands on this treasure, this goodly portion of Solomon's treasure. And where did he take it? He took it back to his home grounds, the Languedoc region of southern France, the foothills of the Pyrenees. And there it remained for several centuries. Meanwhile, a lot of Jewish refugees fled Palestine because of the revolt and were settling in southern France, and they began to be assimilated with the Franks, and pretty soon they created the nation we know as France. They also created the Merovingian line that could trace their line back to the Fisher King and back to Jesus. And they were acknowledged as the legitimate rulers of Europe until the Roman Church authorities decided, we don't want this competition. So they managed to eradicate the Merovingian line, or thought they had, and they then instilled the rule of the Roman Church, or the Catholic Church, Catholic meaning universal, and it became the official church of Europe. Now we're in the Middle Ages, and the Dark Ages, and the church was the power. It was the control mechanism. But there were people in France who were the descendants of the people of the Goths who had brought this knowledge, and they still had some of this knowledge, and they knew about the treasure in the foothills of the Pyrenees, and because of that, they knew the rest of the treasure is over beneath what had become Herod's palace in Jerusalem. So they got one of their relatives, Saint Bernard, and he fomented the First Crusade. We're going to bring freedom and democracy to the Middle East. Okay? Actually, they're after the rest of the treasure. So they go over there, and sure enough, in 1099, they sacked Jerusalem, and they captured Jerusalem. Well, 9 knights showed up, all of whom are related to these French Cathar families, the Blanchefords, the St. Clairs, and they said, we want to form a military order to protect pilgrims on the way to Jerusalem. And King Baldwin says, okay, and he sets them up as the poor knights of the temple. He was probably in on it. I think at a certain level, all of them knew that they were there to get the rest of the treasure. And of course, quickly they changed their name and became known as the Knights Templars. The Knights Templars grew wealthy and powerful because they didn't guard the roads to Jerusalem. They tunneled under Solomon's palace and under these horse stalls. And we know this because in the early 1900s, British soldiers doing excavation there found Templar signs, Templar insignia. So they spent years tunneling under there, and they got the rest of the treasure. And they took it with them back to the Languedoc region of southern France, hid it away in the cave systems there. And this gave rise to a continuation of the stream of knowledge, mostly through the stonemason guilds, which were created by the Knights Templars. And the reason they created the stonemason guilds was to spread this knowledge through their people in Europe, because the stonemason guilds were among the only groups that were free to travel from country to country, city to city, as they built the great cathedrals. And so we can see and trace Solomon's treasure from Jerusalem to Rome to the Languedoc region. When they got back, this is what they had: not only gold, silver, precious stones, which made the Knights Templars extremely wealthy, but also this knowledge. Heretofore in Europe, castles were just square stone things with maybe a turret on it. The Knights Templars came back, and all of a sudden they were building flying buttresses and archways and all of this wonderful technology, architecture, things that had never been seen before. There's stained glass in the Chartres Cathedral that today is still so luminescent that modern science cannot explain how they did that, because they still had remnants of the knowledge of the ancient Anunnaki. You can also see the similarities between the mosque in Jerusalem and the Chartres Cathedral. We can also see the similarities between the winged Egyptian goddess and this carving in an ancient Jewish palace. Here we have the Black Madonna with child, and here we have Isis with the child. Okay, it was all the same knowledge being passed along. By the time of the coming out of the Dark Ages, this was all held within this underground stream of knowledge, and was largely kept by what we now know as alchemists. And they were playing around with it, and they had it a little bit, but they didn't have it 100%. They didn't quite know how to do it. Uranus Philalethes, also known as Thomas Vaughan, was a 17th century alchemist, and he wrote the Philosopher's Stone, the Holy Grail, if you will, is nothing but gold digested to the highest degree of purity and subtle fixation of very fine powder. So they had knowledge of creating the monatomic gold powder. This leads then to the mystery of Rennes-le-Château, the little town in France where Father Signet discovered in the late 1800s some genealogies showing the family of Jesus and how it survived, and how that his wife, Mary Magdalene, came to southern France. I know when I was at Rennes-le-Château, I was pointed out a cave over across the valley, and I was told that's the cave of Mary Magdalene. I said, "Oh, that's nice. Did they name it after her?" And they said, "No, that's where she lived." So, I mean, over there it's just accepted fact. It's only in the West that we argue all about this, as those of you who might have seen Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And we see similar Masonic signs in both Rennes-le-Château and in Washington, D.C. And you have to understand that the Knights Templars were then destroyed, and they tried to do away with them. So they just blended back in and into these stone mason guilds that they had formed, and this was the beginning of what we know as Freemasonry. In Da Vinci's Last Supper, the largest portion of the painting is this V shape between Jesus and the figure on his right, which was the ancient symbol for the feminine. The pointed pyramid is the masculine, the inverted V is the feminine, and when you lay one on top of each other, what do you get? The Star of David. But I blew this up because to me, this is obviously a woman. Look at how her dainty hands are clasped, and look at the features. And of course, this caused a big stir among the hard-nosed Christians at the time that the Da Vinci Code came out. But I think I can pretty well put all this to rest. Here are three other depictions of the Last Summer. One, a 13th century German painting, one from Jean Vercoix painting, and then Albrecht Dürer did this one, and in all three shows Jesus with a woman. And it was Mary Magdalene and his brother James who continued the teachings of Christ after the crucifixion. And it was Paul, the newly formed Christian, who they called an apostate and ran him out of Jerusalem. So he had to go wander up through Asia Minor and through Turkey, and finally made his way to Rome. And then he finally got in with some of the Roman authorities, and they found out that he didn't like women very much. He thought they didn't belong in the church, and he had a very narrow and structured view of Christianity. So they decided he's okay. And that is where the Roman version of Christianity really got started. Also, at the Rennes-le-Château area, if you connect various sacred sites there, it forms a giant pentagram, and they said this was an ancient temple to Isis. Nicholas Poussin tried to tell us that the Ark of the Covenant still played a big role, even long after the crucifixion, by including them in his paintings. And we also have a Knights Templars painting from 1147, which shows the Ark of the Covenant. And even today, the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, we see a replica of the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant played a very big role in their knowledge. And why was that? Well, because in the Bible it gives a very detailed description of the Ark of the Covenant. It was arcaded wood plated with pure gold, and it gives the dimensions, and it was 3.5 inches thick of pure gold. Well, this is estimated to weigh 2,714 pounds, and yet we see these pictures where they got 4 guys, maybe 6, and they're just carrying it along. How do they carry more than a ton? They can't. But it's full of the white powder. What did I tell you about the white powder? 44% less weight. So in other words, they weren't carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they were guiding it as it floated around the ground. Ancient technology. We now know that that's entirely possible because in the late 80s, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory used a ceramic superconductor to create anti-gravity and lift this magnet off the ground. So, was the Ark of the Covenant a low-frequency life-wave superconductor capable of creating a Meissner field which can nullify the magnetic field of gravity? And is that because it was filled with the monatomic white gold? Oh, that brings us back to, well, then what did happen? I think there was exotic technology used that we don't know about. So that takes us back to Gilgamesh, one of the first epics in human history, where he, with his non-human companion Enkidu, attempted to locate the ancient gods so they could learn the secret of immortality. They now thought this was all myth, except now using ground-penetrating radar have located what they feel like is Gilgamesh's tomb, and it's in a rock under the Tigris River. Saddam Hussein believed himself the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar, and he was rebuilding Babylon, so he had an interest, a fascination with this ancient technology. So since he thought he was the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar, let's take a quick look at Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar built a structure out of gold, okay? And it tells in the Bible the exact dimensions, the whole thing. Apparently he had created an energy field because every time his people went in it, they died. So he was nonplussed, so he goes down to Palestine. He gets 3 Hebrew priests, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, brings them up, and he says, "You're going to make this work." And they said, "You're not our king. You don't you don't believe in our God. We're not going to do it." He says, "Okay, then I'm going to throw you in there, and you either make it work or you're going to die." Interestingly enough, though, he didn't just chunk them in. First, they donned their raiments and their hats and their cloaks. Why would they make mention of this unless there's something very special about what they were putting on? So what were they putting on? Radiation suits? Anyway, go back and read in the Bible. They go in there, and Nebuchadnezzar, he doesn't want to get anywhere near this thing, so he hollers at his minions and says, "Are they in there?" "Yes, O king, they're in there." "Are they still alive?" "Yes, O king, they're still alive. In fact, there's another one in there. There's a 4th person in there." "What? Who is that?" "O king, it's the Son of God." There it is right there. So what? He created an energy field, a stargate. And somebody came through. That was the last we heard of that. We don't know who that was or what happened to him. But what we do know is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego survived, and that King Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed with their knowledge that he put them in charge of Babylon, taking care of everything. And Saddam Hussein was working for that same thing. So are we talking about gaining future technology from the past? Yes. Now, we all know the United States went into Iraq to try to get weapons of mass destruction. And we all now know, they didn't find anything. I'm here to tell you, yes, they did. They didn't, but they didn't find what we were thinking of. We were thinking they were going after nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. No, they didn't find any of that. But what did they do? They violated military strategy, which says you attack the enemy's country, you seize a portion of it, you consolidate your winnings, and then you move on to the next objective until you conquer the whole country. We didn't do that. We made a beeline for Baghdad, left the countryside wide open, still armed. This is why we're still having problems over there. And what happened in Baghdad? The looting of the Iraqi National Museum. And I have the stories in my files that show that in 99, 2000, 2001, French and German archaeology teams were making, quote, amazing new discoveries in the ancient Sumerian cities of Uruk and Ur. And so where would they have taken these amazing new discoveries but to the Iraqi National Museum? And they had to be cleaned up, they had to be cataloged, so they were in the basement. They were not yet ready for display. 170,000 items were looted on the upper floors, and most of those have been returned because they ended up in flea markets and they were able to track them down. Oh, but we did guard the oil embassy, the oil ministry, and the Pentagon had promised museum directors around the world that we would protect the Iraqi National Museum, but we didn't. Colonel Matthew Bagdano says it was assigned by General Tommy Franks to investigate the break-in at the Iraqi Museum, and he said the basement is what we've been calling an inside job. I will say it forever like a mantra. It was inconceivable to me that the basement was breached and the items stolen without an intimate knowledge of the museum, and from there about 10,000 pieces were taken, and we've only recovered 650 approximately. That's what they got, the ancient weapons of mass destruction technology. So now we can see that the ancient technology, ancient knowledge has spread westward from Mesopotamia, the home of the Anunnaki. And we can trace all the way down how that knowledge has been passed down from one secret society or one group to another. And now we even see the Pope today. Here's a picture of him in 1944 as a Hitler Youth. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of our largest, most populous states, his father was a Nazi Gauleiter. The Nazis are still there. And we've already talked about how that they run the countries. And they've created a new empire in the United States, a Fourth Reich, and now we've swapped National Socialism for Marxist socialism. And here's my prediction. By 2012, if we have an election, people are going to be so upset, so despondent, so angered, so beat down that they're going to go for the guy who says, give me the power and I'll straighten this up. And that's when we're going to get real National Socialism. By the way, I do have to mention this. Nothing's changed. General James L. Jones is the new National Security Advisor to Barack Obama, and in early 2009 he went to the Munich Security Conference and he says, as the most recent National Security Advisor of the United States, I take my daily orders from Dr. Kissinger. Hey, whoever voted for Kissinger? All right, so the Nazis are still in firm charge, and look at it. Here's a United States postal stamp, looks just like the old Nazi eagles. We're even now wearing the German helmets. Look at that. The American military back in the 80s, when they started going to this new German-style helmet, they nicknamed it the Fritz. Here's the U.S. Naval Barracks in Coronado Base, California. Nobody noticed this until Google Earth came along and they said, hey, look at that, man, that's a big swastika. And that, you know, are you ready for this? The Navy said, gee, we didn't know it looked like that. And I'm thinking, what, nobody looked at the blueprints? The Fourth Reich, folks, it's growing up all around us. And who is it that's trying to rule humanity through deceit and secrecy? Well, according to the ancient tablets, it was this Anunnaki, these ETs that were on the earth in ancient times. So there's only one of two possibilities. Either at some point they all left, or they all stayed, or at least a portion of them stayed behind. How do we answer that? Very simple. We look at Earth's history. If it's like we've been taught, just one slow evolutionary grind from hunter-gatherers to city-states to empires, you know, then okay, I guess they left. But that's not what we see. What we see is throughout history, things flying in the air, the Ezekiel and his fiery wheel, crop circles, UFOs, the attack of 1942 over Los Angeles, where there was a huge globe that just moving along very slowly, and they shot and shot and shot, and they couldn't bring it down. So the record speaks for itself. A portion of them are still here. Well then, who is this? So a portion of the ETs are still here, and when yet we also have the evidence that a small clique of people are trying to gain control over the world. So I see three possibilities. Either this ruling elite, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Henry Kissingers, either they are trying to contact these ancient creators, or two, They're already in contact with these ancient creators, and they're being guided or controlled by them. Or 3, they are the ancient creators, and they're on the planet of the apes, and they're not content to be one of the apes. They want to run the planet of the apes. But there's 6 billion apes, and you can't physically control 6 billion apes. So the only way you can control the planet of the apes is through secrecy, deceit, and control mechanisms like religion and money. And that is my story for you today.